Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out today to Flyleaf Books. We're your local independent bookstore, and we really appreciate you being here. It's your attendance and book purchases that let us have these events, so thank you. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from David A. Graham as he presents The Project with Frank Bruni. David A. Graham is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and national affairs. He won the Toner Prize for Excellence in National Political Reporting for his coverage of the 2020 presidential election. Frank Bruni has been a prominent journalist for more than 3 decades, including more than 25 years at the New York Times. All right, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Remember, you can still order more copies of The Project up front. We are sold out of the book itself, but we can get more. When we get more in, we can have one with your name on it. And if you didn't get your book signed yet, there will be time for that as well after the talk. I'll come back up here. I'll direct you out into the store for the signing line. All right, thank you so much. And here we go.
Is this on?
It is.
There's a red light. That doesn't bode well. It's a bad start. Sorry. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, and David. Thank you for doing this for all of us. I'm delighted to be here with David. We're Duke colleagues, so we see each other in the hallway frequently. There are many things about you that impress me, but I want to start with one that I think this is the thing about you that may impress me most of all. You read all 922 pages. I had that right, 922?
That's right.
Okay, so on a scale of 1 to Middlemarch, how was the prose?
It's a real mix. There's some that are written very clearly, that are really to the point and even persuasive in places, and there are some that are really written by policy wonks. And I hope I'm doing service journalism by getting through that for all of you.
How long did it take? We'll get to more substantive questions shortly, I promise you. But how long did it take you to get through those 922 scintillating pages with all of the cliffhangers, I imagine, and that sort of thing? And how much caffeine was consumed in the service of that?
It didn't take that long, but there was a lot of caffeine. And then there was a lot of going back and rereading and trying to understand how the Pentagon budgeting process works, or remembering the minutia of Medicare Advantage, things that I don't use a lot in daily life, but that are really important for the project and really important for people.
Yeah. And do you feel you have this stuff now trapped in your mind forevermore? Is it taking up gigabytes and megabytes that might have otherwise been?
I hope nobody quizzes me on too many of the details, but a lot of it I think is. There's so much. There's just so much ground that it covers, and that's one of the things that surprised me about it, was that it was so comprehensive and just all over the place. I mean, bouncing between sweeping proposals and really weird small bore stuff, sometimes in the same paragraph.
I think a lot of us think of Project 2025. It's almost like this kind of amorphous, nefarious boogeyman of a phrase, right? Or it's that recurring joke or prop or whatever that Mallory McMorrow used at the convention. But I think most of us actually kind of don't know a lot about how it came to be. Or can you give us the kind of short biography of Project 2025? Like, how did it begin? How many authors does it have? That sort of thing.
Yeah. So, the roots go back, you could say, as far as 1980, when the Heritage Foundation put out a document called Mandate for Leadership that became a sort of blueprint for the Reagan administration. And this is meant to follow in that lineage. But it also has roots in the end of the first Trump administration, when a lot of alums came out of it thinking that not that Trump had been a failure as president, but that Trump had been failed as president. And they wanted to make sure that the same things didn't happen again. So you had people who were like Russell Vought, who was the head of Office of Management and Budget, Paul Dans, who had worked in the Presidential Personnel Office, and then members of the cabinet. And they wanted to make sure that when the next Republican president came in, which they hoped would be Trump, he would be ready on day one. So they wanted to have personnel vetted, identified, trained, and ready to go on day one. They wanted to have a set of policies prepared. They wanted to have executive orders written in a playbook for the first 100 days, which I think we've all experienced now. And they wanted to have methods for these things. And I think that is what I didn't grasp until I read the whole document in one sitting, was how methodical it is and how they thought about not just what they wanted to do, but how they were going to achieve it.
And is it meant primarily to kind of educate this army of reformers, or whatever you want to call them, on what they need to do, or is it just specific marching orders, or or a combination, an amalgam of both. It's hard to, those of us who haven't even done 122 pages of Project 2025 have a hard time envisioning the document.
So it's a mix, and they start out by talking, it's broken up mostly by agency and by department, but they talk about these kind of broad ideas, and they have this critique of the administrative state, as they say, or the deep state, as Trump called it, but basically of the federal bureaucracy and of the executive branch. And they complain that it's slow. They complain that civil servants are liberals and they're saboteurs and they're lazy. But they also complain that political appointees in the first Trump administration were lazy and Bush holdovers and weren't ready for prime time. And they think that the executive branch needs to answer more to the president than it does. So they want to take over departments, but also take over things that have traditionally been independent. So, the FCC, the FTC, the FEC, this whole alphabet soup. They think it's a real problem that these people are appointed by the president, but don't just follow his policies and do what he wants them to do. They think it's a problem that the Justice Department doesn't answer directly to the president. So they have this scheme for taking over the executive branch, and then a lot of policies they want to implement. And I think, these things are really important, but it's also important to realize what they want from that, which is this very conservative, or maybe not conservative, right-wing social vision that they see the government as a tool for implementing.
And how do they justify that? Like, they're obviously saying, here's what we want. In the service of what, and how are they saying this is what the country needs? Like, what is their rationale for this all being necessary and ideal?
So there's a mix of things, and there are places where they have critiques that I think are fairly persuasive. I mean, they complain that Congress engages in preening cowardice and has given up a lot of power. You're gonna have a hard time finding someone who disagrees with that, I think. But then the solutions they offer are to give the president more power. And there's a mix. There's a little bit of a constitutional critique where they say, there's no reason anyone in the executive branch should not answer to the president. And the structure of these agencies is simply improper. Or that civil servants should answer to the president and he should be able to fire them if he doesn't like what they're doing. But a lot of it is also based on this idea that America is a Christian nation. It was founded as a Christian nation. And if we're going to save it, we have to move towards that social vision, kind of by whatever means necessary.
By the way, I love as an oxymoron preening cowardice. That's a great one. Does it feel like a document that in its aspirations, in its values, is autocracy-minded, autocratic?
I think it is. I mean, I have been trying, not always successfully, to describe it as right-wing rather than conservative, because I think it is radical in a lot of ways. There's an attempt to give so much more power to the president and to create a situation where the president doesn't have a lot of check on him from Congress. And although they sometimes have more limited justifications for what they want to do, in the hands of somebody like Trump, you can see exactly how it leads to an autocratic government.
And when you look at, we're obviously at the 100-day marker right around there, as innumerable media interviews and stories tell us, how much of what we've seen in the first 100 days is straight from the Project 2025 handbook?
Not all of it, but really a remarkable amount of it. So I finished this book, I finished my first draft in January, and then it was sort of wait and see, are they actually going to do these things? And I have been surprised by how closely they have followed it. There's certainly Trumpian flights of fancy that don't follow this, but if you look at the executive orders, dozens of them come straight from Project 2025. When you look at what DOGE is doing, it's sort of doing exactly what they laid out in terms of taking on civil service, sometimes by different means, but the end is exactly the same. There are things they haven't done, but I see them moving very much according to this plan and with the direction of the people who wrote Project 2025.
Are there things that have happened in these 100 days, things that Trump and the people around him have done that contradict Project 2025, that actually show some daylight between that document and what they want to do or what they've done? Yeah,
there's a couple things that come to mind. One of them is tariffs, where there's and this is another thing that I didn't expect or understand until I had read all 922 pages, but there's a raging debate inside the document about tariffs, where you can see the kind of seams of the Trump coalition and where things haven't come together yet. There are a lot of places where the Republican Party and think tanks like Heritage have accommodated themselves to Trump's vision, but there are places where they haven't, and I think economic policy is one of those. You have dueling chapters, one from Peter Navarro, who is now in the White House, arguing for tariffs, but tariffs specifically targeted at China, as part of this sort of existential conflict with China, not the kind of tariff everybody, throw the tariffs up, just do it left and right kind of approach that Trump has done. And then you have another chapter arguing that actually tariffs are a terrible idea. They're going to impoverish Americans. They're not a conservative tool of governance. Another place is Ukraine, where the authors are more hawkish. I mean, their attitude is that Russia is a threat and the US needs to stand with Ukraine. And they say somewhat optimistically, everyone on the right agrees that Ukraine has the upper moral hand in this battle. But I think we see that that is not in fact something that everyone on the right agrees about.
These authors, they're named in it, they stand behind, I mean, their names are attached to these views. When Trump has acted in contradiction of those views, have they spoken up? Have they kind of recognized that publicly? Or have they done what seems to be the Republican pattern in the Trump years and just kind of zip their lips and pretended they're actually for it or fine with it?
More of the latter. The person who wrote this free trade chapter has been critical, and I spoke to him 2 weeks ago, just as Trump was lowering more tariffs, and he was sort of apoplectic about it, was willing to go right through where it was. But he's somebody who is ensconced in the think tank and has a little bit of insulation. These people who are involved in the government, and many of them have gone back into the government, are keeping their heads down, and they are hoping to use. I think they want to use Trump as a vessel, and they realize the best way to do that is to stay on the same team.
What's the money behind Project 2025? I mean, in terms of these think tanks that generate it, et cetera, who's funding this, for just to use an over-reductive term?
It's a lot of the usual suspects. And it's hard to say exactly who's funding it, because it's not just the Heritage Foundation, which convened it, but it's kind of a big tent of many, many organizations from the right. So I realized I dropped the question you offered earlier about how many people contributed. There's like 70 contributors. There are dozens of these organizations involved. And so you have Koch brothers money, you have the U-Lines, you have a whole range of people.
Do we have like the tech bros like Peter Thiel? And
the tech bros are still, Peter Thiel has money in a lot of places. The tech bros were a little still on the outside when this was written, and you can see an animosity towards them. And I think where that money comes through is in this weird melding of the really traditional gender role stuff with deregulate everything, get rid of environmental regulation, reduce regulation on a lot of businesses, reduce taxes, abolish the Fed. So there's sort of like niche interests from across the coalition.
I know this is sort of like hard to make you pick and choose, but what of its recommendations, what of its priorities scares you the most?
It is a tough question. I think,
and if you want, we can open that bottle of wine you got. That might help.
I think in the immediate term, the things that scare me most are this real attack on LGBT people, on trans people, on family life as a lot of us know it. That's like an immediate. I feel that's very urgent. I think the attack on environmental regulation across the board is really scary. That's something that will not be felt as immediately, but is existential in its own way. And then the attack on the system and the way it paves a path for authoritarianism is a sort of, it's a really abstract threat, but I think a very serious one. So the mind reels a bit when I have to pick.
As I think we all remember, as you've talked about before, in other appearances of yours, Donald Trump has at times said, I have nothing to do with this. At other times, he's not said that. What is Donald Trump's relationship to this document? And when I ask that, I mean, not only is he aware of the degree to which it's influencing him, et cetera,
Yeah, Trump said he hadn't read it, and I believe that. But I don't believe much of the other stuff. This is written by a quarter of the people who wrote this document were in his administration in high-ranking jobs, in the cabinet, for example. Russell Vought was the head of OMB. He's the head of OMB again. Paul Dans was in the personnel office. Russell Vought worked on this and then was the chair of Trump's policy committee for the Republican National Convention. So even as he's saying that he doesn't know what they're doing, he's choosing the same guy to write his platform for the 2024 campaign. And then he's hired these people back into the White House. I think there is an element where Trump has minimal interest in some policy areas. Trump cares a lot about trade. Trump cares a lot about immigration.
Trump's not a policy wonk?
he's been talking about those things since the 80s, and everything else, I think there's a symbiosis. So they get a lot of these policies that they want, and they can sort of fill it in because he doesn't care. And he gets a legion of people who are coming in. They're loyal. They want him to succeed. They want to empower him to take on the deep state. They want to demolish guardrails around the Justice Department so that he can use it as an instrument of retribution. So everybody wins. Even when he may not care about the particular details, he's happy to have them on the team.
If we could pause for a second on Russell Vogt, because I feel like he is as emblematic of this administration as anybody else, but flies a little bit under the radar in terms of what people know about him. We don't see him out there the way we do Pam Bondi. We don't see him ridiculed by opinion columnists the way we do Marco Rubio. But I think he's more telling than a lot of them, and my guess is some people in this room know his biography well and some don't. So could you give us a little bit of a tutorial on Russell Vogt?
Yeah, I mean, he flies under the radar because he looks and sounds exactly like a budget wonk. I mean, he has the chunky glasses and he speaks in a very calm and reasoned sounding way. I mean, the things he says are pretty radical a lot of the time. He went to Wheaton College, the Christian conservative college. He came up through fiscal conservative circles in Washington. So he worked for Phil Gramm, the big deregulator. He worked for Jeb Hensarling, who was a Republican from Congress, who'd also been a Gramm staffer. He worked at the Heritage Foundation. And coming into the Trump administration, he seemed to me like a bit of a weird fit because he has this very traditional, value-minded approach to the world. He's a very devout Christian in a way that Trump, needless to say, is not. And he also is a real fiscal conservative, or he has been in the past. And so to get into the administration, he had to accept this guy who, is 3 times married and a philanderer and doesn't seem to care a lot about this, and also somebody who wants to spend a lot of money left and right. And so in that sense, he's emblematic of the sort of accommodation that a lot of the right has made with Trump. But he has, in that deal, gotten a great deal of power. And I think his cleverness that comes through here is recognizing that OMB, which is a kind of boring office, can actually be really powerful. And he writes that, I'd say OMB directors in the past have been often really adept bureaucrats, people who were very smart, but they were not people who were usually in the news. And if they were, it was generally bad news. Something had gone really wrong for the OMB director to be in the news. And Vogt calculated that he says it's like the air traffic control system for the White House. And he calculated that you could use that to do a lot more than other administrations have. He complains that departments have used it to push their priorities to the White House, and it ought to be the other way around. The White House should be using OMB to push its priorities down. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we've seen. So you see Vogt in the first weeks of the administration writing to CFPB employees and saying, stop working. You can come to work, but don't do anything. I'm cutting you off. You see him trying to freeze funds for a lot of departments. So he's been totally correct about the power that OMB has, and he's flexing it quietly all the time.
I mean, learning more about him and thinking more about the authors of this document, do you feel like you have a better understanding that you can share with us at what religious people, professedly Christian people like Vogt, how they come to terms with Donald Trump and how they kind of justify their support for even ardor for him?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways they do it. One is I think it's about the ends and not the means, and they're willing to treat him as a vessel, which is an idea we've heard from evangelical Christians for years now. I think another one is that the sense of persecution comes really naturally to them. So you hear some people on the right talking about a sense that it's like the early church. They are marginalized, they're persecuted by society, and they have to hold out for their values. And when Trump talks about persecution, I think there's a natural affinity between them on that. Though we'll also talk about things in really theological terms, and he'll make a theological case for why he thinks the border needs to be shut down. And so
What is the theological case?
I mean, it's basically that we need to take care of our neighbors first. And he defines neighbor in a really narrow way. But he cites chapter and verse, and I think it's dubious, but it is not unthought out.
And in that persecution martyr sense, did the assassination attempt on Trump help as much as many analysts think it did? weird to say did the assassination, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I think everyone knows what
I think it did. I mean, you even heard Trump talking in more convincing religious terminology, I think, after that than at any other point. A little bit messianic, more than a little bit messianic. But he seemed to suddenly buy into it, and I think that that also made them believe. I mean, there's a lot of this idea that Trump was saved by God to do something, and now we're seeing what that was in their eyes.
What in Project 2025 that has not happened yet, that has not been repudiated by something that's happened yet, might we be on the watch for? What's still coming down the pipe?
I think the effort on the family is so important. The things they want to do to what they say to bolster the biblically based family, and they see it as a whole of government operation. So they want the Labor Department to encourage childcare in the workplace because that encourages people to have more children. They want the Education Department to track a lot of outcomes by family structure so they can encourage family structure. They want to use...
Wait, what does that mean? Track outcomes?
So they want to know how are students' scores basically corresponding to their family structure. So they have this sense that they want data that can prove that people who are coming from non-traditional families, or whatever that might be, have worse outcomes. And so then they can use that as grist for the mill. They want to use housing and urban development to encourage marriage and discourage single parents. They want to use health and human services to push traditional ideas about fatherhood. They want to use welfare programs run through faith-based organizations to tutor people and tutor unwed fathers in traditional notions of fatherhood. And then obviously they want to ban abortion. Short of banning it, they have a bunch of ways they want to crack down on it or surveil abortion at the state level. We've already seen from Trump's executive orders the idea to define sex as binary, so they want to literally write trans people out of existence, out of the government's language. And they've done some of these things, but it's so sweeping, and it's something that's clearly so important to so many of the authors that I think that it hasn't happened yet because it's slow, but I think it's very important to them, and they're going to keep pushing on it.
I'm not being cheeky. How can the education department track anything if it doesn't exist?
There are these fissures where you see one author arguing that a department can be used this way and another author arguing that it simply can be abolished. In the case of the education department, I think it's also, they want to abolish the education department, but they really want to keep a lot of the things it does. So they understand that states depend on federal funds for their schools. So they want to abolish the education department. They want to keep money moving to the states. And what they want to do with that is just give the money to the states with no strings attached. So that, for example, red states can start funneling that money into vouchers or into religious public schools, as we see Oklahoma pushing to do at the Supreme Court tomorrow, I believe. Even as you're abolishing the department, it's sort of an administrative tweak, you can still use it to do things. But I think in a broader sense, you're right. They are doing these things that are contradictory. You see Musk laying off nuclear scientists, and yet in Project 2025, they want to grow the American nuclear arsenal. You can't do that if you don't have nuclear scientists, and they don't always resolve those conflicts.
Yeah, no, as you were going through, they want, through this agency to do this, you were outlining research, tracking, policy. This sounds big government-ish. This sounds like it's in tension with Doge.
I think it is big government, but even with Doge, they want to lay some people off. They think that there are people who are low achievers, but they also think that once they get their loyalists in, they can push the government in this direction. But I think there is a tension. I mean, it's on the one hand, they want to shrink payrolls. On the other hand, it is very big government. I mean, there's a willingness to use the muscle of government in coercive ways that previous conservatives have not. Stuff about fatherhood and the family is hardly new from Republicans or from Barack Obama, for that example. But what's different is the willingness to enforce that with the government.
Based on the priorities of Project 2025, the values in it, is there anything Trump could plausibly do in the coming months and the coming years that would actually cause a rupture with these people, that would actually get them beyond acquiescence to something like confrontation?
No. I don't know. I don't think so. I have thought that at times in the Trump era, and I no longer think so. And I think that's partly because they are working on such a long time scale, and they see that they have already made a lot of progress. I mean, they write in the document that they need to do as much as they can in the first 100 days, in the first 2 years before the midterms, and in the first 4 years, because they want to change the baseline, but they're thinking well beyond Trump, and anything they're doing to move in that direction, whatever else Trump does is probably just collateral.
You mentioned the midterms. I'm guessing the majority of our audience here is Democratic tonight. Democrats
In
talk
Chapel
a
Hill?
lot. Democrats talk a lot. It's a geographic guess. It's a book-related guess. It's just partly, my extrasensory perception. The midterms come up a lot, like maybe the midterm, and then you always hear the lament, like if there even are midterms, is the sort of shorthand for, is there stuff in this book, in Project 2025? I don't mean your book, but yes, in your book in terms of proving it. That gives you, that you think kind of fuels actual fears that we will have fair midterms?
They focus less on that, and Trump has attacked elections. But for them, I think they are more creatures of the system than that. And so they want to change people's attitudes, and they want to change the structure of government, and they want to give the president a lot more power, but they're not so directly anti-democratic in that way. They're willing, I think part of this is strategic, they're willing to make common cause with people who are. And it's those alliances that we need to watch for.
So, bottom line, reassuring or not?
On elections or in general?
On elections.
Yeah, I think there's some reassurance. It seems to me like elections are more likely than not at this point. It's weird that I even have to handicap that. But I think that even if Democrats do very well in the midterms, there's so much that will already be in place. Will already be permanent. It can't be snapped back, even with a change of government. And I think that is really bracing.
Do the 922 pages of Project 2025 get into the media much?
A little bit.
Because can we move beyond? Because I want to ask you, you just finished teaching a class at Duke on Trump and the media, right?
Yeah.
I am curious, in terms of Trump and the media, if we can just move beyond the book, what that has happened in these first 100 days vis-a-vis a free press, vis-a-vis media coercion, all of that you find most troubling, since you have been, I imagine, tossing this around with students for 3 months.
Can I tie it to the book anyway?
Huh?
Can I tie it to the book anyway?
You can tie everything to the book.
The thing is, when you write a book like this, suddenly everything looks like Project 2025, and so I open up
Except
the news
like Project
every day.
Runway.
I could find an angle. Don't try me. But one of the authors of the book is this guy Brendan Carr, who is now the chairman of the FCC, and he talks about ways to intimidate the media by threatening their broadcast licenses, which is exactly what we see him doing. We see him, threatening to pull a license from Comcast because it's like what MSNBC is doing. We see him demanding materials from CBS to intimidate them over an interview with Kamala Harris, and now we see the executive producer of 60 Minutes stepping down because of that. We see him exploring ways to revoke funds from NPR and PBS, which is something they have done exactly that. Yeah. Again, there's a cleverness to the way they've thought about this and the way to undermine things like CPB. And one of my students pointed out in a paper that CPB now uses underwriters because previous Republican administrations have insisted that they fund themselves a little bit. And then in Project 2025, Carr is saying, hold on, you're supposed to be non-commercial, and here you are taking advertisements. We're going to revoke your funding over that. We should cut you off. So there's, it's a little diabolical, but it's smart. I think seeing just how fragile these corporate media owners are who have other corporate interests has been really scary. So that's Paramount, that's Disney, that's Jeff Bezos. For them, these media properties are not the most important thing they have. The left, people on the left have been critiquing corporate media ownership for a very long time. But I don't think it's been clear just how fragile that is at any point. It's right there. And it's, I've seen friends fleeing from the Washington Post, which seems to be crumbling after being so strong for a good stretch. And it's a reminder how fragile all of this is.
You and I have not compared lists of students this semester, but I actually got some papers on the CPB too, and now I'm a little bit worried that they may have been double dip papers. We have to find out whether we got some of the same. I'm not kidding. AI is not our only worry. You mentioned the Washington Post. How many people here regularly read or subscribe to the Washington Post? And you still subscribe. You weren't among the people who could. I still do. I'd be curious, because you're in the media, because you just taught this course, because you're a smart guy. What Bezos said in terms of the editorial page was really alarming. The fact that Amazon Prime paid, what was it, $40 million for a Melania documentary, because the world so needs a Melania documentary.
You don't think that was just fair market value?
Oh, of course it was fair market value, yeah. Half the budget of a big budget movie. But I read the Post, and its coverage remains extraordinarily critical. And even in the editorial pages, I'm reading stuff all the time by Dana Milbank, Catherine Rampell, that seems to contradict what Bezos said was this new narrow mission. What are we to make of whether Bezos really intends to make this a paper that is more pleasing to Donald Trump versus whether he's just said some words to get Trump off his back?
I think it's early to tell on the editorial pages, where we still don't have a new person in place. And so, my understanding from folks there is they're in this wait and see mode. They understand that supposedly at some point they're going to be on this free market and personal liberty thing, but they don't know what that means because they don't know who their boss is and they don't know how closely that will be enforced. I look at the news coverage in the Washington Post, and even as some of their top reporters have decamped to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, they continue to be so good. I mean, they're breaking news about Trump. They're covering it so well, and I think they were as good as the New York Times in the first Trump term. But it's concerning to see Bezos so openly treated as a mercenary proposition, and it makes it hard to trust somebody once they've done that.
Yeah. I want to talk about the writing of the book. You wrote this in 2 months, is that right?
6 weeks.
6 weeks. How many words is it?
27,000.
Okay, so at least it's not like 80,000, right? How did you write it in 6 weeks? For those of us who would like to be more productive than we are, can you give us some tips that go beyond just drink another cup of coffee?
It was a lot of coffee. A deadline really focuses me, and the deadline was impending. I don't know. I mean, my day job is to, I sort of think of myself as like a first responder. Like, news happens and I try to synthesize it as quickly as I can and write something and put it up on the Atlantic's website in the hopes that it helps people sort of get started on that. And then I have colleagues who will come in middle term and long term. And I was sort of just doing that here. Just trying to make sense of it as quickly as possible. I think though that a lot of generalist reporters could have done this. You have to know a lot about how the government works, but I have been doing it for a while and know a little bit about a lot of parts of the government, and that was essential for it.
What if I don't ask you this question? Someone will, because these are very smart people. Where do you find hope right now?
I got this question last week in an interview, and I have had since.
Oh, good.
Then
So you got plenty of
prepare,
practice.
And yet I still don't have much of an answer. I just filed a piece about polling on Trump, and it is historically bad. It is remarkable. I think it suggests that people who were not paying close attention and thought the election wouldn't be a big deal are now doing that, and I think that's good. I also think, one reason I think talking about Project 2025 is important is that it forces people to think more in a systematic way, and I think people are doing that. They're no longer thinking, Chuck Schumer is still thinking in a very reactive way. He's taking whatever happens moment by moment and responding kind of poorly to it. But I think there are people who are realizing you have to think on a longer term, and the right has been so good about this. They were so patient on overturning Roe. They've been so patient and slow on expanding gun rights. They were patient and slow on this kind of takeover of government. And anyone who wants a different vision has to think in a broad and systemic way. And I see conversations among Trump's critics in the center and on the left that are thinking in that way now, and I think that's really positive. We shouldn't take a lot of the things we have for granted. People have done that, but now they realize they can't, and they're thinking in a different way.
And Project 2025 is in some sense a mirror of that patience, right?
Yeah.
So should Democrats be writing an analog to Project 2025?
I don't know if it should be direct. I don't know if they need to write Project 2029 exactly, but I think they need to think in the same way. There needs to be a set of policy proposals and a way to implement it. And there needs to be, there's a big tent here. These were a lot of people brought together from across the MAGA right. And they don't agree on everything, but they managed to find a program that they could generally coalesce around. That seems like something Democrats don't have right now, but something they need.
Are there Democrats out there who you think are doing better than others in terms of thinking long term and not being reactive like Schumer, but being, I guess, a word I hate, but proactive?
I think it's a mix, and I think it's too early to tell. I'm intrigued by what Chris Murphy is doing. You look at somebody like Bernie Sanders, and he has been in it for the long game. His vision is, not all Democrats subscribe to it, obviously, but he knows what he believes. He's been working on it for a long time, and you see AOC working in that tradition too. But I think Democrats have really struggled to find a single voice. There's still, Democrats still can't decide why they lost the election, and it's hard to move on to the next election when you're so busy relitigating the last one.
Okay, so an easy last question, easier than the hope. Why did Democrats lose the last election?
People weren't paying attention. I just think there was a lack of attention. Every time I see a story or I talk to somebody who is surprised that Trump is implementing tariffs that are crashing the economy, I think you weren't listening or you didn't believe it. And in fact, there was a Democratic poll from October about Project 2025, and it was, policy by policy, people hated these ideas, and they just didn't believe that Trump would do them. And he's doing them, and he's not fixing inflation. And I think they bought into the lie, and now we're seeing the wages of that.
He is strangely a man of his word, right?
It is a paradox. He very much is.
I wanted to leave robust time for your questions, and we have a little over 20 minutes for those, and you are game for questions.
Absolutely.
So David is here to answer whatever you want to ask him. You want to call people, or?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll start. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to get your comments about the Constitution. I think
I'm
most
pro.
of you're going to have to do better than that. Most of us, I'm sure, think that President Trump has crossed red lines practically every day. That Trump thinks of the Constitution as maybe a nuisance, maybe an obstacle. What about these Project 25 authors? Do they have any sense that the Constitution is the bedrock of this country and cannot be trampled the way I think Trump is trampling it these days?
I think they've thought a lot about it, and they have a vision that I bet you would disagree with, but I do think they have a vision of the Constitution. So, for example, their critique of the civil service and of independent agencies is this is a constitutional abomination. They believe that the president should have all this power, that he should control the executive branch. They believe that Congress should be the most important branch, but it has abdicated a lot of that responsibility. And the weird thing about this is, even as they make this critique, they then say, and thus we should grab more power. So I don't think they resolve that very effectively. They don't espouse the same sort of attacks on courts that Trump has. And in fact, they have this faith that if they can just get the right cases to the Supreme Court will overturn the precedents and will be on their side. I think that's an open question. We've seen a little bit of a mixed record so far. They're willing to do things that, like the immunity ruling last summer, that seemed shocking, but they were not willing to play ball in the Alien Enemies Act recently. If that faith is not rewarded, I'm curious where they go. But I think they are acting according to the Constitution.
So I just got an email from some guy named David Graham that he arranged about the Trump polls, and you talk about how it's going down. Does he care?
It's interesting. It seems like he doesn't care as much as he once did. It used to be you could watch the market go down and wait for the reversal. Just like look at it, watch the market tank, look at Twitter, give it 90 minutes, you'll see something. And that hasn't been the case as much. I think the way you see him lashing out at pollsters, though, yesterday, is a sign that he understands it's a problem for him. He has to make these things work, he has to keep Congress in line, and he has to have popular support. Or Republicans will start, Republicans are maybe craven, but they want to be reelected also. Lindsey Graham, one of the more craven of them, said, if you don't want to be reelected, you're in the wrong business. And when those things start to conflict, that's where they may not really stand up to him, but they're not going to go along with some of the more sweeping things. It's hard to exert power. So I think it does matter. Of course, what matters more is he won the election. That is the thing that has the most consequences. Yeah.
So, civil service came in as a program when the government was a lot smaller. So what is their next step? Say more and more civil service becomes appointed or by the executive or the president or whatever, and they get to fire whomever and how many ever tens of thousands they want at any moment. How do they see this happening? Like every 4 years, a president can like fire everyone and put their loyalists in, and then 4 years later, I mean, are they looking at the basic destruction of that whole system of government? I mean, how can that work every 4 years where you get to fire everyone and just put your people in, and 4 years isn't that long?
Yeah, the short answer is it can't. I mean, there are things that that you can replace every 4 years, but there's so many parts of the government that aren't political and that work on a much longer time frame, and they can't be replaced. I think there's a couple ways they think about that. One of them is, Russell Vought, as I said, he says these really outrageous things in a very calm way. He gave a speech, I think in 2024, where he said, we want the bureaucrats to be traumatized. We want to put them in trauma. So it's not necessarily they want to fire them all. They just want them to be afraid. They want them to be subject to firing so that they do what the president wants. And it's an amazing sort of cosmic irony situation. James Shirk was a guy who worked in the first Trump administration writing Schedule F, which is this plan to convert a lot of civil service employees to political appointees. And he told a ProPublica reporter, like, we don't want to lay 50,000 people off. That would be crazy. You would hobble the ability to do what you wanted to do. And then, of course, Elon Musk comes in, and that's exactly what he does. So these are these places where they haven't resolved the tensions. But it opens up the possibility of a total turnover every 4 years or every 8 years. And on an intellectual level, I think they would say, fine, like the president should have control of the government. But of course, the result seems like it would be total paralysis.
When you talk about politics, you're talking about the relationship between power and authority. And we seem to have a very powerful president. The greatest power is in the people when they're united, but Republicans seem especially talented at dividing the public. Do you see some ideology or issue that could unite us so that we could oppose this strong man?
I think it's challenging. I mean, I think the power of the people, well, first I'd say they phrase these things as a question of power of the people. They say the president is democratically elected, and so he should have control over bureaucrats. So they use that kind of language. The system of government that we have is certainly flawed, and it has had its problems. But generally, I think it works really well, and it's hard to get people to rally around something that has been. When they're upset about parts of their lives, it's hard to get them to rally around those institutions. I don't know. I am such an institutionalist at heart that I want people to return to those institutions, and I don't know how to get people excited about that. And I guess that's one reason I'm a journalist and not a politician. So that's my cop-out. Sorry.
The idea of fissures came up earlier in this conversation, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about something that would really develop into a true fault line, either existing inside Project 2025 or in Trump's departure from that. Where would that be?
There is the Republican Party has for a long time depended on this alliance of social conservatives and pro-business conservatives, corporate conservatives, however you want to phrase that. And this is one attempt to reset that balance. So there's a lot of deregulatory action. But there's also these some tempered steps towards giving workers a little bit more power. I think a lot of people on the left see the Workers' Party rhetoric from Trump and write it off as totally nonsense. And I think it's thin, but I think there's you see some real effort in Project 2025 from people like Josh Hawley. Trump seems like the only person, and then you have the natalist wing, and you have the very social conservative wing. Trump seems like the only person who's able to keep those things together for now. So after Trump, unless you have somebody who's able to keep the same coalition together, and I just don't think J.D. Vance has that kind of political deftness. you're gonna have to rebalance that again. And I don't know what that's gonna look like. Yeah, back there.
You're hearing about a third term.
Who knows? I mean, it's so hard to grapple with. It's obviously unconstitutional. He obviously can't do it. And he's done several things before that he obviously can't do. He wants to do other things that he obviously can't do. So I don't know. I mean, it seems like there are the people around Trump who are pushing this are the people who are personal Trump loyalists. People like Boris Epstein. It's not the more policy-oriented people. And I think that's because for them, Trump is a vessel. They are trying to build a government for the future. You know, once he's gone, they'll harness on to somebody else.
Yeah, I asked this as a former longtime USAID worker. Is it gone? What's happening with U.S. soft power overseas? Can the State Department ever be rebuilt and USAID rebuilt?
I should ask you. You are the expert. You know, in Project 2025, they want to make USAID more of a tool of foreign policy. They think it's too squishy and soft and humanitarian, and they just want to save people. When in fact it should be used to support American policy initiatives overseas. They didn't advocate for getting rid of it.
So is that Elon Musk? Where did that come from?
I think it's a cynical political play. Because they know, and there's a reason they started there, which is that they know that foreign aid is not very popular. We spend a tiny portion of the budget, something like 1% of the annual budget on foreign aid. And people, when they're polled on this, consistently think it's 15 or 20%. And they don't like that. They think there's ways to spend that money at home. And so it's a soft target. And because they have other things that are more important to them, they were willing to sacrifice that soft target. And then once they've sort of gotten into the system, then DOJ can go through and start hollowing out other departments as well. So that, I think, is what's going on. Yeah.
If and when there is another election, do you think Democrats have a chance at winning? And if so, what is the platform that they should be focusing on if that happens?
In some ways, it doesn't matter. I think they'll do well in the House in the midterms because they always do, and because Trump is very unpopular. But structurally, they're going to. I can't see a path to Democrats winning the Senate. So you can slow things down a little bit with the House. You can do a lot of oversight. You can, as we've seen, impeach a president but not convict him. But I think it's a lot harder to see where you go from there. And even if Democrats can win the White House in 2028 under any platform, the Senate is still going to be a real challenge. And if you're trying to rebuild the government in a different image, which is I think what Democrats are going to need to think about. They're going to need to think about it, not putting things back the way they were, but building things new in a better way. It's going to be hard to do that with control of only the House and the White House. Mm-hmm. Yeah, back there.
I think I read a headline that said the military will be using the state level for immigration enforcement. Is there anything in Project 2025 that deals with military enforcing things?
Yes, they want to use the military on the border. It's very much in line with the kind of rhetoric Trump has used about this being a national emergency, about it being an invasion, and they want to use that to justify then using active duty military to police the border, which is typically not allowed under the Posse Comitatus Act. So that's one proposal that we've seen. They haven't done that yet, but it's something they can continue to turn back to whenever they would like to try.
Is it something that they would then use the military for them to take
I don't know. There's a reason that Congress banned the use of active duty military within the borders, except in very rare circumstances. Yeah.
Do you think there's any hope at all in the fact that a lot of this is being done by executive order, which doesn't stick as much as it might if it were, say, a congressional act?
Not as much as you'd hope. So first I'd say this is a way in which they diverge from traditional conservatism. I am old enough to remember when Republicans were outraged that Obama was talking about using his pen and phone to use executive orders to get things done, which means I am 10 years old. So they don't care about it. They're happy to use executive orders for those things. But those things are only weak if there is a Congress that is willing to do something about them. And if Congress is not willing to do anything in the short term, they become more and more permanent. So once you lay off a lot of civil servants, once you have a sort of brain drain that we're looking at, you can open positions up again, but you're not going to get the same people back. You're not going to rebuild the programs that were there. You're not going to just flip the switch back on for the kind of research that was going on. So I think in that sense, even though they are a little bit weak in a legal sense, they're going to be really permanent.
Did you see anything in the 2025 that spoke to, and I'll use one of your colleagues in the panel, who is this old school kind of Republican conservative, but someone who is really intelligent, really well-minded. That element of their party, which there were a lot of them, they're going to lose. I think they're going to lose those people by moving in such a radical direction. Do they care? Does the document show any semblance of care or planning or repulling those people back?
So I'd say two things. One is there are places where they try to integrate those people, and I think Tom has been so admirable in laying out his principles and saying these things. There are people who write particularly the foreign policy and defense sections of Project 2025 who are very smart and very serious people. And they seem willing to go along with these other things, or at least willing to put forth proposals because that's what they think they should want. And some of the goal of this was to get all these people in the same room to kind of create a consensus. I think insofar as do they care about losing those people, it's about power. And if losing those people costs them power, that's a problem. But if losing those people is the price of moving towards the structure of government they want and moving to the grab of power they want and then the society they want, they're willing to make that sacrifice. And they understand that a lot of these things are unpopular. Heritage took a poll last summer and they found something like 17% approval for Project 2025. There's a reason they want to move fast, and they know that these things are fragile, there will be pushback, and they want to get them done as quickly as possible so that they're harder to roll back.
Does the Project 25 speak specifically to the health and well-being of the American people? Because it seems like the CDC, that they want us poor and sick.
It's really, I think the HHS chapters are really interesting. And there are these things that feel like they might have a lot of appeal, maybe even in this room. There's a critique of the employer insurance-based system. There's a concern for a revolving door between the medical or the pharma industry and regulation. These things have brought. There's a call for all expectant mothers to have doulas. It's a whole range of things that may not. You could see a lot of people on the left espousing, but at the same time, they want to make the CDC much more political because particularly there's a real frustration with the closure of churches during COVID, and it really seems to have radicalized some of the authors. There's a desire to cut Medicaid. There's a desire to limit healthcare under the VA. They want to push people into Medicare Advantage because it's a more private system, although the outcomes are not measurably better and though the cost to taxpayers is not lower. It's a weird farrago of things. I don't think it totally coheres, and it's not as uniform as I might have expected.
A lot of the stuff in Project 2025 is like a culmination of 40 years of this. What's something, since you read all 900 pages, what's something new, or are there new ideas? Or is it just, hey, we've caught the car and now let's see what happens?
I think the newest thing is the method of power, but there are these interesting things. I mean, the push towards giving workers a little bit more power in the workplace feels new. It feels part of the kind of Trumpist right, and I think those ideas are incomplete. I don't think they're offered as an alternative to unions. I don't think that they achieve what unions would do, but you can see them grasping for these things and really trying to figure out how they can be more labor friendly without also alienating, the kinds of people who fund this sort of thing. You see some of these pushes around natalism and birth rates, I think, where they are sometimes exploring new ideas. So yeah, there's a little bit of it. But I think the power is the most important new thing.
Next question needs to be the last one. I'll
Okay.
check this off.
Back there in the back. Yeah, yeah, you.
So I've heard you mention several times Trump being a vessel. I don't want to sound like a cynic, but
Go ahead.
I get the impression that Trump's primary agenda is to consolidate his own power. So I can easily imagine a scenario where he gets that piece. He's using Project 2025 instead of the reverse.
Oh, I think that's
His
right.
vessel. So, okay, that's.
I think that's right.
I really want to see if you.
It's a symbiotic relationship. He gets power, which he wants, and they get to fill in these gaps and things he's not interested in. So they have a whole broader agenda that is not just immigration and trade and retribution. And they get their people into the government appointed by him, and they manage to work on those things. And that gives them what they want. He gets what he wants in terms of power, in terms of loyal staff. So I think it's a vessel, but I also think it's a symbiosis, if that makes sense.
David, thank you.
Frank, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
If you didn't get your book signed before the event, David will sign your book now, right? Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, David.
And that signing line is going to be out of the store room. So I'll meet y'all out there.
Oh, good, thank you.
I see you got front seats. Yeah, thank you for letting us know about this. This is amazing. Yeah, hi. Don't pull me out of line. I want to get my book signed. I'm not going to. Jane's back there too. She's in the other room. Okay, let's go have a glass of champagne. Oh, yeah. Used to work at Charles.